record button. All right, everyone should get a warning that now they're going to be recorded. All right, so today I'm really excited to welcome Teresa Hyuna Huang. She's a community engaged architect, educator, and facilitator. She is the founder of Department of Places, a participatory design and community engagement practice based in Los Angeles, California. So you have much warmer weather than we do right now, to Mary and Robert's point earlier. She has spent over 13 years focused on equitable cultural and community development with multiple groups and campaigns. Additionally, she is the current director of Design Futures Student Leadership Forum, a national training initiative focused on elevating the role of the designer in dismantling systems of inequality. She was the former director of community design and planning at the Skid Row Housing Trust, a nonprofit permanent supportive housing organization where she was the Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellow from 2009 to 2012. Her work has been featured in Architectural Record, The New York Times, Atlantic Cities, Al Jazeera America, and other media outlets. She is on the board of directors for Venice Community Housing and formerly on the board of the Association for Community Design. She was recognized as one of Next City's urban vanguards in 2015, and she got her master's in architecture from Harvard GSD and a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering and Art History from Johns Hopkins. She's a licensed architect in California and a LEED accredited professional. And we're really excited to welcome you. Thank you so much for being here, Teresa.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate the invitation and really just the space to share some of my story, my work, and my ideas. And so I am going to screen share. Here we go. Is that working, friends? Yeah. Okay. No, I was really excited about sort of the opportunity to, sorry, I'm trying to get my settings straight. Okay. Oops. Okay. Sorry. How do I go back now? Here we go. Volleying with technology. Welcome to Zoom 2020. But I really wanted to take this opportunity to really pause for a second. I think, so the title of my talk is really checking in and really thinking about self-care, but also collective care. And I think this is where some of my professional work begins to come in. I don't want to pretend that we're not in 2020 and that we're not in the midst of a collective traumatic experience, of a pandemic, of a potential political coup. Who knows what is on the horizon? And so I just wanted to actually take this as a moment of for personal reflection, but also collective reflection and a space to ground as well. And so I'm starting with sort of some words from one of my most important teachers, Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Vietnamese monk, who really, his practice of Buddhism really grew out of the Vietnam War and his own need to deal with the suffering and trauma that he experienced during that time, but also what are some tools that his community needed during that time as well. And so I sort of just wanted to invite everyone to just take a breath. We're going to spend an hour together, which I'm really excited about. But I also want this to also be a space of hopefully nourishment and pause. And so I wanted to just offer a little reminder that you are a miracle. And so reading from the book, Be Free Where You Are, Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "For me, an orange is nothing less than a miracle. When I look at an orange in the here and now, I can see it with my spiritual eyes. The orange blossom, the sunshine, and the rain going through the blossoms, the tiny green orange, and then the tree working over time to bring the orange to its full size. I look at the orange in my hand and I smile. It's nothing short of a miracle. Breathing in and out mindfully, I become fully present and fully alive. And now I see myself as a miracle. Dear friends, you are nothing less than a miracle. There may be times when you feel that you are worthless, but you are nothing less than a miracle." And so I just offer that as a reminder, as life is really hard. that it took so much time, energy, the work of generations to bring you here and now and us all together, and truly how remarkable that is. And so just invite you to take a breath, unclench your jaw, maybe lower your shoulders. I'm happy to be in community with you all for the duration of the time. So I wanted, when I was trying to think about what to talk about, sort of this is my usual snapshot of, the work that I profile on my website. And I use words like, build community capacity, community-led visioning, design facilitation, and really thinking about what anti-racist design pedagogy can look like. But I realized, this is sort of the on paper version of me. This is the piece that is the professionally validated parts of my identity. And I started to really think, especially during this pandemic, I've really taken it as an opportunity to really look at myself, because I'm sure we all, as folks can work from home or go to school from home, life has completely been compressed on top of each other, right? We are so much more exposed to our personal sides and personal identities, and really the parts of ourselves that we typically have to leave at the door have come into all of our not only learning spaces, but our workspaces as well. And so I've actually seen that as a bright spot of the pandemic, because I feel like that's an antidote to white supremacy, which actually, forces a professionalism that forces us to actually erase parts of our identity. And so I wanted to really think about, well, then who am I beyond what shows up on my resume? So I started to sort of like list out on this right-hand side are the pieces that actually was read in my bio, right? This is sort of the externally validated parts of me that are worthy, right? Like I have a Bachelor of Science in Engineering. I, went to Harvard GSD and got my MArch 1. Sort of all the things that the world and really white dominant culture says, like, good for you. These are the important parts of you. And these are the parts of you that we want to see. On the left-hand side are sort of the unpaid parts of myself. These are the parts of me that are a part of my DNA. I may not have chose these experiences, or, they're unpaid and volunteer spaces, but to me are equally as important as what shows up on the right side. And so things like, I am Korean. I self-identify as Asian American and a woman of color. I'm the first person in my family to be born in the United States. I come from a beautiful immigrant community in New York. I learned, I started going to protests in post 9/11 when I returned back home to New York, and, started Korean drumming as a way to connect with my ancestral homeland. I founded an arts collective while I was in grad school, and all these volunteer opportunities where have equally informed my design practice, and I would say, if not more. And then I would say, as I get sort of closer to my current sort of manifestation of who I am, my practice of mindfulness, and then really of motherhood have really completely changed fundamentally, not only who I am, but my design practice as well. And so I would say a lot of my work, and then I started to then put it against the backdrop of what was happening in the world. So what was going on in the collective consciousness? So, right when I graduated college, 9/11 happened right after. I started the Rose Fellowship, which is an opportunity where architects are placed in nonprofit affordable housing organizations right when the Great Recession hit. And I founded my own practice in 2015, really right after the founding of Black Lives Matter, the death of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and so many other people whose murders were, made visible, and sort of like the collective awakening around sort of the carceral state and state sanctioned violence. And so also recognizing a lot of my practice is not only reflective of my own personal identity, right, the left-hand column, but it's also in connection and alignment with what's happening in our collective consciousness. And I would say really in the last 3 years, it's been about bringing it together. Like wearing and taking off these different hats is exhausting. And again, like for me, that is the work of white supremacy, to compartmentalize, right? Whereas like prior to all of this, when I think about like my way back ancestors, like they just were, you know, maybe they were farmers, they were mothers, but it all happened at once. And you weren't forced to choose. And I feel like in the past few years, I'm like, I don't have energy to hold all these different balls. Like, let's come together. And I think 2020 has been a blessing for me in that one sense, in that it's forced me to reckon with a lot of that. And so I actually, I'm going to share 3, I would say, projects or case studies from my life story, essentially, that have really informed who I am now. And I really see my professional work as a full extension of my whole self, right? It's not just the way I make money or the way that I exist out in the world. Like my work is my purpose. And so for me, it's about like, let's synthesize as much as possible. And so as I was sort of reflecting on some of this, I realized that, you know, there are 3 phases, and literally this is just framing that I came up with, like, I think last night at 2 in the morning when, you know, I couldn't fall asleep, that these are the phases that I sort of cycle through, the way of seeking safety and, you know, understanding what are my personal needs, and how do I attend to and care for myself so that I feel safe. And then once I feel safe, I'm able to then move into a phase of ethical engagement, which is the process of relationship building. And then once those relationships are built, you know, what is that process of co-creation? What is that shared doing, action, behavior that then begins to ripple out? And so I feel like the phases of the moon, this is always constantly happening, right? It's never a linear process. Sometimes, you know, they may actually be happening all at once as well. And so life is messy, and I'm realizing, I'm like, work is messy, and accepting that has actually allowed me to grow a lot faster. And so my phase of seeking safety that I really wanted to share, that I hope sort of resonates, especially with all the students, happened when I was actually in grad school. I also want to give some explicit definitions, because I realize that, you know, we all may be using words in different ways. And so what I've also learned is the more explicit you can be, the more shared understanding there is. And when we have understanding, we avoid sort of misunderstanding and conflict and potential harm that could happen. What I've learned is when I feel safe, I feel like I can rest. I feel safe when I'm with my people. I feel safe when no one is judging me, or, you know, if I don't feel shame. But I also think it's important that I don't feel like I need to please another person or sort of fulfill someone else's expectations. And really the key part of my own personal safety is that my needs are actually met. And so I want to share my experience founding and being a part of an Asian American arts collective while I was living in Boston, which I moved to start grad school. And I think it's important to be explicit about what I was seeking safety from. So when I started the GSD, I was like so excited to like finally learn architecture. You know, I was an engineer undergrad, and I was like, oh, I can be creative. This is going to be so awesome. I spent 2 years working for a landscape architect in New York, and like we were you know, I was the model maker, and I was like, I love making things. And then I got to school, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is not what I expected. Like, oh, I'm not supposed to be here. Oh, all my ideas are wrong and bad, and I'm stupid. Like, it was a space. It was also the first time I was in a space that was, you know, predominantly white and wealthy. I think, you know, I went to a private undergrad, but I still very much, you know, growing up in an immigrant community, I still stayed within sort of affinity groups. And again, that was a space of safety and familiarity. And so when grad school is a lot smaller, and then, you know, you filter out more people, I was like, oh my gosh, like someone lives next door to Prince. Like, it was mind blowing, you know? But also just, I kept on being reinforced that, you know, this was the right way. my way of thinking was actually wrong. And it was really hard. I think it not only took an emotional toll, but like physically, like my nervous system started to get out of whack. Like, I was, drinking and smoking cigarettes and doing all of these things that I thought were trying to actually, I'm realizing, as I was older, to like sort of self-medicate and sort of dull some of this like really harsh criticism and judgment that I was not expecting. I was hoping, a space of like educational growth and nurturing. So what I was seeking safety from was really the toxic environment of my design education. And so I was fortunate enough to link up with two other creative Asian American people that I knew through sort of my network in New York. And we were like, we need a space for ourselves. Like, we need a space where we can just like talk shit, tell stories, do whatever we want, but ultimately it's for us and it's created by us. And so like sometimes, things just align. And one of my good friends, his parents opened up a bookstore, many, many years ago that was first like a Chinese language resource for sort of first generation, like my parents' generation, or his parents' generation's peers. And so it was closed for a long time. We sort of reopened it because what a dream, access to a storefront. And we turned it more into like a second generation Asian American space. And, one of the good friends that we started this work with was a spoken word poet. And so the first thing we did was we have to start an open mic. This is also like the early 2000s when like open mic and Def Poetry Jam was like all the rage. And so that was sort of like the cool thing to do. And the more I realize, and when people ask me like, oh, when you do all of this social impact design work, what was your most important experience? And I always tell them it's like organizing an open mic, hosting an open mic has been by far the most important job gig that I have ever fallen in love with. And, it was not only the space for me to get enough courage to then tell my own story, because the media portrayals of Asian American women were not right. They were not my story. But it gave me a sense of personal power to be able to sort of speak up and again find the courage and be able to take risks from within. But then, the soft skills that come with organizing events, hosting, facilitation, like how do you actually hold space and create a space of safety so that other people feel courageous enough to share their story. And then ultimately with that vulnerability comes the connection. With the connection comes relationship. With relationship comes community building. And so for me, it was a firsthand experience at not only community building, but I started to understand what self-determination meant. And for me, living through that experience, embodying it, making mistakes, having fights, coming together, really being a part of a community and then building something together, fundamentally changed not only who I was, but my practice. And I'm like, look at this, like, this is it. Like, this is all I want in life. And so sort of when people are like, oh, what do you want to do when you grow up? I'm like, I want to run a radical Asian American bookstore and art space. Like, in my 20s, I was able to do it. And, this is still an aspiration that I try to hold. And so for me, going through this process of understanding what is a space of safety that I need, where is a place of, collective expression, became super important. But for me, that was the first step in actually cultural organizing and understand building the skill set needed to do the work of changing the world that we live in. And so some of the sort of lessons learned is that when I feel safe, I feel like I belong. And for me, like, belonging is key, because when I feel like I can belong, I can be courageous. And for me, like, I keep saying that word because it's so important, because that's the space of growth. That's the space of change. That's when, that's the place of power. And I think what I'm starting to learn is that not everyone has access to that. And, that is an inequity in our society that is unfortunately reinforced by white supremacy, because, I know where I don't feel safe and when spaces are not designed for me. And so the self-determination of places has been a key concept, or sort of a foundational outcome that I have been striving for in my design work. And again, like, this was a way that I started to care for myself, which I'm learning is the first step in changing the world. Being able to not only care for myself, but make the changes internally. And so I see the second phase as being what is ethical engagement. So for me, this is the foundation of relationship building. And to me, relationship is the most important thing in this world, right? Like, we are humans, we are social people, like, we need each other to survive. And, at first I was like, I called this ethical engagement. And then I took a step back and I was like, I'm going to be really honest about and self-critical about my work, where I would say, I have high quality, deep engagement in my work, but is it shifting root causes or systems of oppression? I would say maybe not really. And to me, that's what equity work is. It's the reallocation of power and resources to begin shifting the systems of oppression that begin to limit the opportunities of people, based on identity, class, and so on. And so I reframed it as ethical because for me, it's about trying my best. It's about being honest, compassionate. And again, this idea of open-heartedness and vulnerability becomes really important. And so being able to create sort of the fertile ground for relationship building has been a key outcome in some of my engagement work. And so this is sort of that piece on my timeline when I turned 30. I moved to Los Angeles. I grew up on the East Coast. And so moving to LA was a huge shift. And, I started the Enterprise Rose Fellowship and started working with a nonprofit housing organization. And so when I came to Skid Row, I also only had sort of like the pathologized single narrative of the homeless capital of the US. In like the 10 years that I've been there, I've learned that it's so much more, right? When you are actually dealing with a community that has experienced deep trauma, then you're also dealing with a community that holds the most imagination and resilience, right? Because all these things come together. And so for me, actually, I thought I came to Skid Row to like support the unhoused crisis of the country, but I realized that I came to Skid Row to begin facing my own childhood trauma, begin working on my own struggles with community violence, family violence, a lot substance abuse, a lot of the same issues that a lot of people who are unhoused were facing, but also realizing how to do that work without shame and stigma. And so what I think it's important to also point out that this was a 3-year fellowship position, which is a pretty significant amount of time. I think, the work I did with the Arts Collective in Boston was also 7 years, right? So it's not something that happened overnight. Like, it took a long time to nurture. And so when I first started out, it was about, how do we create quality design for all? And actually, this was the first time I became exposed to the idea of trauma-informed care. The Skid Row Housing Trust, which was my host organization, not only developed, the housing developments, but also was a social service provider and a property manager. So they try to look at like, how do we support the whole person beyond just a roof over their heads? And so, some of my supervisors began to throw around, well, we make such beautiful buildings, like we partner with such amazing architects, people like Michael Malton or Koning Eisenberg Architects. What we're doing is trauma-informed design. And then I started to piece it apart, and I'm like, well, designing for people who have experienced trauma is actually not the same thing as trauma-informed design. The same thing of, racial equity work is not the same thing as working in a community of color, right? And so being able to be explicit about what your intention and making sure the outcome begins matching it, and it's not just sort of like optics. became an important lesson that I started to learn. And so in the first 3 years that I was working at the organization, I actually was very aware of how far I was from a lived experience of someone who was unhoused. And so I didn't immediately go and start thinking about, well, how am I working on the ground? What am I doing to, support people who are currently experiencing homelessness? I realized I'm actually not a social worker. I don't have formal training in it. What I'm realizing as a place of intervention is actually the organization. The buildings are beautiful, they look fly, but there's actually no resident engagement. There is no integration of actual lived experience or lived expertise. And so I started to really think about, how do we shift the protocols of the institution, right? And so if like my first phase was about like organizing for myself, me as a person, Asian American person, a woman of color who was impacted, how do I organize within my own marginalized community? This was more of, well, you know what? I'm actually further from the lived experience of the people who are most impacted. How do the possibility for harm is much greater then, right? And so it became, well, how do I work with staff? How do we bring more people to the table to influence the design of housing so that it's not just, the top 2 people of the organization? How do we get residents who are currently living in our buildings, who have, made the transition from living on the streets into housing, to incorporate actually what we can do to make our work better? And so creating an engagement process and creating a social infrastructure within the organization to really think about inclusion. And so after a few years of doing that, it became a standard practice of, oh, every time we have a project, we need to talk to residents, we need to talk to social workers, the janitors, that became a place of impact. And then it was about after 4 years when I started to realize, the impact of our housing always ended at the property lines. But the issue with Skid Row spills out into the public space. It is sort of a neighborhood scale issue. And so after having an understanding of, the community after working there for 4 years, but also beginning to understand my personal positionality and relationship to the social context, I sort of realized, I'm like, oh, people actually know who I am, or I have a deeper understanding of some of the power dynamics that are in play. And so started to think about what is a neighborhood scaled, community-led vision for what a holistic and supportive neighborhood could be beyond just, the housing building. And so was able to, create and build upon my relationships with community leaders, with other grassroots, community-based, member-based organizations. And so created sort of essentially a coalition. We called the project Our Skid Row because we really wanted to create, again, a resident-led future vision for what the neighborhood could be, because in a neighborhood like Skid Row, it's very piecemeal, and all the policies are very, imposed by sort of city planning and people who design from ivory towers. And so this was an opportunity, and I'm really thankful the way that this project was able to be launched. I started to grant write, was able to piece together $100,000 worth of funding from 2 different foundations, and we launched this project. And at this point, the organization sort of believed that resident engagement actually made our work better. And so no one sort of doubted or got in the way of, thinking about what this project could potentially be. And so for me, this was an opportunity to really push what high quality and ethical engagement could potentially be. And so it became an opportunity to really think about what is my personal role as a designer. And, so often we're taught, it's the person holding the pen and being like, this is the vision, right? That's the Beaux-Arts. And again, sort of like the white dominant, white supremacist version of like a top-down hierarchical view of the role of the architect. I started to realize, well, coming back to being an open mic host, it's actually about passing the mic. It's about holding the space. It's like, how do I continue to, I'm still making space, right? It's just not about me. I'm not in the center, right? Someone else gets to step into the circle and share. And so realizing creating tools to articulate ideas is a form of architecture became important. And then in all parts of the process, shifting who is in power of telling the story, right? And so in a traditional low-income neighborhoods, a lot of times people are research. I was like, no, that's not right. Like, our residents are going to be the researchers. And so, I create templates, but what questions we're asking, how we're going to collect the data, how we're going to analyze it, and what we choose to say is important was all the work of residents. And so, we held many, many workshops, and, I was sort of like, it was a little bit of a poke in that I wanted to, again, like reappropriate design tools, like have our residents be able to read sections and draw sections and design in section and say, this is what I want the streetscape to be. We were building models and collages and, doing pinups and sort of like sharing ideas. I saw this as an opportunity for community members to also gain design skills so that, we could read plans and read sections. And so anytime there's a new project coming down the pike, we have more critical skills to then be able to influence it better. But then again, like use multiple tools for representation to get your ideas out. Like, sometimes design education is right? Like we learn how to iterate, refine, and visually express our ideas so that our intention is clearly communicated. And, community workshops took many, many different forms. And for me, this again was a giant open mic. It's how do I hold the space, get the resources, right? So get the money, buy the snacks, take out the trash, do all the stuff, set up the chairs and make sure that sort of like the infrastructure is there so that people can fill it with the wisdom that they hold, but then also creating space for co-facilitation with residents. And so residents are the ones sitting at the table, standing in the center saying, this is what we're trying to do. This is how you can help us. Again, how do you build the capacity? And then thinking about culturally responsive engagements, so much of Skid Row is about life on the sidewalk, life on the street. And so we didn't want to have all of our workshops indoors or because, you need to like be on an email list or see a flyer. Like if you're still living on the sidewalk, you're not getting those outreach materials. And so we built our participation station and, we had interviews and workshops out on the street. And for me, a really important part of this project was also about how do I support the next generation of design leadership. So I was able to, hire two of my former students and another young woman of color from Los Angeles to really be, again, not only co-creators of what the design tools could be, but the ones to facilitate the process and gain this firsthand experience because things like, facilitation, designing engagement activities, you don't get to learn in school and you need to practice because you shouldn't be practicing on your own in a community when, the stakes are too high. And so wanting to create a space of scaffolded learning, right? And learning through doing became an important process. And then, we also had like cool titles and we paid them $30 an hour and made sure that it was as equitable as possible. And then, so, we created essentially a set of community demands of what a neighborhood vision that prioritizes people who are unhoused would look like. And we really wanted to make sure that it was an advocacy tool that we can last for the long time. Like we produced this in 2014, maybe. And the thing that's the best is like people will still have a tattered copy of this map to this day and talk about it and reference it. And so really thinking about how can the project have a longer lifespan or beyond sort of like what that process, engagement process is. And then for me, my greatest lesson, especially working in the context of Skid Row, is like, you need to stick around even after the project ends, even once the money runs out. Like as a person, as a community member now, like as someone who now genuinely cares, have friends, and is seen as part of the community, you have to stick around. And so we also, so this is actually, I left the Skid Row Housing Trust in 2015. I think, after being there for 6 years, I got to my end of that relationship, but also, so this was all sort of like out of pocket, self-funded, immediate pop-up temporal, community made with found objects representations of some of these community ideas. And so we created these safety zones, which was sort of a high priority design solution that the community wanted. And, you know, there was a lot of energy around this work. So it's like, how do we continue to build off of that and the coalitions and the relationships that were built? And so for me, a lot of my learning through this process, and, you know, this has carried through multiple projects of, you know, working in Little Tokyo or Philly Chinatown, or, you know, even creating creative placemaking curriculum for national intermediaries, that some of the most important lessons that I've learned is that when you genuinely care, people know, people feel it. And so for me, again, it always comes back to relationship, and it needs to be reciprocal. It needs to be mutually beneficial, because if it's still one-sided in that, you know, who gets the credit or who is getting visibility, that, you know, that still feels a little bit exploitative. And, you know, some of the things that I wish that I did differently is that, you know, we didn't compensate community leaders. Like, there was no budget for it. And that's something that I have, you know, now changed, where, you know, we need to give stipends to community leaders because their expertise is valid, right? This should be a paid opportunity, the same way that I am getting paid for my time. Like, I realized when we were having sort of like our working group meetings, the people who were on staff, who were not, you know, who have not experienced homelessness, you know, who were not Black, who were not, you know, queer or trans, were the ones who were getting paid. And then all the volunteers who were, you know, still receiving subsidies were volunteers. And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm completely just perpetuating a pattern of exploitation, essentially. And so, you know, this is me being, again, how do you create a self-awareness? How do you learn? And then how do you change and correct behavior moving forward? And so this is, you know, I always say now, like, we need to compensate our community leaders. We need to compensate, you know, the same way we need to compensate designers and artists. And then again, sort of this idea that a lot of the skills needed to do this work, I never learned in school. I sort of learned through, you know, volunteering, or, you know, fortunately having other community organizers, you know, take me under their wing and seeing and doing and making mistakes, but also then being in spaces where there was enough compassion, but also investment in me to help me begin to refine some of these soft skills that are absolutely critical in doing the work of creating greater care in this world. And so that was, you know, 2015, I started my own practice. And then in 2017, my whole life changed. You know, I got pregnant, I separated with my partner, and I was raising a newborn on my own. Like, my whole life completely crumbled, or it did not go to, like, I didn't plan for any of this. And it was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And, you know, I had to rebuild, I had to redesign my life, who I was. And then again, I found myself moving through the phases. I had to seek safety. I had to think about what ethical engagement was and how could I get to a space of co-creation, you know, but this time it wasn't with a community, it was with myself, with my family, with my, you know, my child's father, with, you know, my own father, and sort of the key, most important and intimate relationships in my life. I realized, I'm like, I need to pay attention to this, because for so long it actually was undesigned and in autopilot, and actually a source of great trauma and oppression in my own life. And so it's always so funny. You need to go that's what 2020 is. It's like, you need to have a moment of reckoning to then be able to repair and then rebuild. And, you know, this is lifelong. Like, I'm in a great place now. Like, I can't even tell you how wonderful 2020 has been in light of everything that has happened, but I'm always going to cycle through it. Hard times, good times, right? This impermanence is an important thing to learn. And so I started to really dive into trauma-informed care. I learned a little bit about it when I was at the Skid Row Housing Trust, but I realized, like, for my own survival, I need to understand my own personal trauma, but it started to make greater meaning to me in practice because I started to take a series of trauma-informed parenting classes and learn about nonviolent communication in order to become aware of my own childhood trauma as to not then pass on that trauma to my child. And so 3 words that I feel like I may be using often that I think will be important to have a shared understanding for is trauma, which is toxic stress. And so toxic stress meaning something that has, emotional, but also very real physical impacts on you. Like it throws your nervous system out of whack. I think it's also important to have like a broad definition of violence. I think, ECHO training uses it, defines it anything that harms or injures the mind, body, and soul of a living being. And I really like that because I think a lot of times we see violence as sort of this active physical experience, but sometimes emotional and spiritual violence is some of the hardest to actually heal because it feels invisible. And like those scars are deeply rooted and embedded, within our DNA. And then resilience being the capacity for adaptation despite the challenging or threatening adverse circumstances that you're facing. And so when I started my trauma-informed parenting classes, like I met this infographic and it immediately clicked with me. I was like, oh, trauma-informed care really is like community engaged design, right? Like the first one. This is like a fundamental, like how to work with communities 101, right? We're trying to shift. So the non-trauma informed is sort of the dominant paradigm. And I'm going to be so bold as to say the dominant paradigm is the one that upholds white supremacy and systems of oppression is power over, right? And so there's always sort of a concentration of power and they have power over people who have experienced the trauma. But a trauma-informed or trauma-aware process is more about shared power. How do we create lateral connections so that people actually have choice and agency over their own lives? Other things that started to really click with me is, instead of going from what's wrong with you that sort of blames the individual who has had it the hardest, it begins to shift it to actually what happened to you. And that question reframes, your trauma is actually not your fault, right? It shifts sort of the responsibility, right? So if it's not your fault, like, yes, it's important to heal, but it's our job to also care for each other, to really think about how do we address the harm and violence without creating more harm and violence. And then, in general, like this infographic, I always refer back to because it really is a helpful reframing of, wow, I didn't realize that, when I come from a place of I'm here to fix you, like that's white saviorism at its best. But then when you look at like, I'm actually here to support healing, what that does in terms of getting at sort of some of the root causes. And so for me, it's always helpful when there are words or frameworks that I can refer back to as a bit of an accountability tool. And so a lot of times trauma is, I'm doing like a really quick overview of this, but I feel like it's important to address because it sort of, I think, makes visible the power of design. But if you look at the top of the tree is typically how trauma is addressed in terms of an individual adverse childhood experience. And so these are things like, there was domestic violence at home, someone in your family had a substance abuse problem. It individualizes the trauma into incidences, which I think is important, but then it also then puts the onus on individual healing, which is not always, I would say, fair or equitable. And I like this pair of ACEs because it also begins to highlight these adverse community environments. And this is where I feel like the power of design has the potential to cause intervention, because this is the collective experience of trauma that we face. This is systemic poverty. This is the lack of, opportunity for economic mobility. This is the soil the toxic soil that we live in and we live out of. And so unless we change the soil, all the trees are going to be poisoned. And so a lot of times when we just look at how do we shift these 10 residents' lives, the next 10 people that move into that neighborhood are gonna, have a poisoned tree because the soil is toxic. So really thinking about what is the systemic, institutional, structural ways that trauma is deeply embedded in our communities, and then how can we use design as a means to begin repairing that. And so, I borrow a lot from sort of the social sciences because I think it's important to look outside of our field. But, these are sort of like the 6 common principles of trauma-informed care. And for me, I feel like 4 and 5 are the pieces that I have been focused on, right? This is about designing with and not for. This is about, agency and residents really guiding the vision. But these 3 first pieces, safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, and peer support, creating a community of practice, have been the pieces that I have been focusing on the past 3 years, because I'm realizing that actually this is quite weak. We don't really talk enough about how design can create a greater sense of safety. And then I would say 6 is the piece that the whole world is reckoning with right now, right? What are the cultural, historical, I hate how they don't have racial, but what are the racial contexts that we're dealing with that actually create, again, this collective experience of trauma. And so for me, this phase that I'm in now is of co-creation, right? So I'm in a place of deep safety, right? I have these deep engagements and relationships that nourish me, that provide me with support, but then I am also providing people with support. And now we're in a space of actually like, I see you, you see me. We have a shared vision. We have a shared way of being, and our behaviors match, and that we actually want to build something together. And so for me, this phase, and this is what abolition really is, it's like, how do we tear down, but also co-create the future that we long for? And so, it's a deep understanding of that, I am not free unless we are all free. And so the way that I'm also beginning to, integrate is, again, that little cloud at the bottom of my diagram is like all the experiences that I have gone through, which have actually been a source of shame or, hidden identity, are actually the pieces that give me the lived experiences to be able to do this work. And so this process of bringing it all together, really, this self-reflection, but also creating the space of like talking with it, telling our stories, and then having shared stories to tell together is where the power lies. And so, I feel like a project or a practice space has really been this anti-racist design training that I am so privileged to be a part of and to curate. And it's really about how do I create the space that I ran from when I was in grad school, right? So going back full circle, if I was in a space where these were the agreements or these are the rules of being, and I showed up and the first thing was about take care of yourself, or if I had instructors tell me, your feelings are as important as your intellect and you need to honor your emotions, like I would have accelerated some of my personal development. And so in this anti-racist design training that we hold, and I have to shout out the U because, University of Minnesota has been a founding university participant from, the very first Design Futures at UT Austin. And really, I also want to shout out James Wheeler because he's always been the university faculty member that has advocated and gotten resources and organized students to come. But our goal is to create a safer, kinder, and braver space for leadership development. It's about how do we nurture the person and not just the mind, right? It's about like your whole self, because creating a space of, full expression is anti-racist work, because we're fighting against this culture of oppression. And so we talk about regulation and really how do you get into a space of generation and growth, but also recognize when you are in a panic mode, which, you click into sort of your trauma response, which is to like shut down, walk out, fight, say I'm no good. We are explicit about like how are ways that we can manage this, and then also provide, people who are their job is to support you, but again, thinking about a community of practice, like the workshops are primarily given by, every single workshop this past year was given by a woman and a person of color. Actually, only 2 men gave workshops and they were both Black men. And so really beginning to create the spaces that I wish I had when I was in grad school again. And then, our topics are around things like power and privilege and talking about the racialized history of sites. But above all of that, it's really about how do we create connection over competition? How do we create a place to actually struggle together? Because you need to make mistakes in order to grow, right? If you expect yourself to be perfect in every single moment, we're actually just continuing like the pressure of white supremacy, because nobody is perfect. Like, we need to make mistakes together and then hold each other and say, I still love you so much. And this is how, we repair. And those are the skills that we need to, do social justice work for the long haul. And I say it's a space to feel feelings, because like literally every year it's a space where like I weep with joy because I feel so loved, and other people feel the same way. And I'm like, this is what a community of practice should be like. And so, some of the questions that I'm grappling with now in this moment of, of COVID and the election is that, beyond trauma informed, how do we get to a healing centered design? Like, I want to create an infrastructure of joy. I want to create neighborhoods where you can just be whoever the hell you want to be and nobody will judge you or shame you, but we can't even be together, right? Right now, participation is looking a whole new way. How do we ask people to be creative when, you're in survival mode? Like, people are on the brink of massive eviction at this moment. And so one of my key struggles right now is, how do I balance community action with community care? Because sometimes right now that's really hard to have the capacity to do both at the same moment. And so I sort of want to share this picture because this, I feel like, is me when I'm most seen and heard, when I feel free, and it's like all my identities at once, So this is me drumming my ancestral drums that connect me to my homeland in Skid Row, a community I deeply care about. Literally my daughter and my sister is right here, and people that I love and community leaders are dancing in circle. Joy in a place that people say joy doesn't exist. And so for me, I feel like, where do you feel most seen and heard, and where do you feel most free are sort of, I ask this to you as, can this be your design parameters? And then thinking about what's your role in collective community care for me is as a prompt in, what is your role as a designer? And for me, I have to give a shout out because it's my daughter's. I'm gonna get emotional, but it's my daughter's birthday today. And I do this work because I want my child to be whoever they want to be. And, life is hard, but life is also filled with joy. And joy is a practice, and joy is work. And, same thing with like liberation and freedom. And so I feel like I want to end with, I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to invite you all to like breathe with me. So I want to end with more teachings from Thich Nhat Hanh, because peace in oneself is peace in the world. And, that's been like the most important lesson I could have learned. Like, right now, life is hard for everyone. And it's important not to pretend like you're okay. We don't want to sort of like ignore the suffering that we experience on a personal level and also on a collective level. But, if you want to do anti-racist design work, if you don't know how an anti-racist life you lead looks like in your own body, it's going to be hard to do that in society. If you want to do healing centered and care centered work in your community, if you don't know what your own personal healing and self-care work looks like, it's so hard to do it externally. And so I always just encourage your body, yourself, your heart is always the first place of intervention and deep understanding. And once you have that embodiment, and you're never going to master it, right? But have an awareness, have a practice, and then find the other people that are aligned, right? Build those relationships, and then those relationships begin to scale, and that's how we're going to change our world. And so I just want to say thank you for also giving me this space to be emotional. I think, you know, my child turns 3 today, and so it's a big milestone because it means we made it to 3, and hopefully there are many years to come. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for your beautiful, open, like just gorgeous talk. I think I really appreciate how the talk itself is a way of modeling leadership. I loved the moments of reflection and that you include your family. My son's birthday was last week, and it is a very emotion-filled time because you project yourself back into the place when they were first born. So we do have a number of questions that are in the chat for you. I want to make sure that we give people time and space to kind of ask their questions as they see fit. I'm going to read the ones first, and then folks, if we want to open it up to just people asking questions that they yell out, we can do that. Let's see, one of the first ones, oh, this is actually a very quick one. Explaining the reasoning behind calling it houseless versus homeless. It seems like a very careful choice of words.
Yeah, I mean, I learned this from people who have been unhoused. You know, I was always corrected. Just because I don't have a roof over my head doesn't mean I don't have a sense of home, right? Home is where the heart is. And so correcting the word to just say, because I don't have a house doesn't mean I don't have a home. So I was corrected, and I like the language better to talk about houseless.
I think it shows that, I mean, the language is really powerful, right? That like it sets up a certain, I feel like so much of what you talked about is like the kind of intention with which you approach your work. And so getting your language right is an important part of that intention setting. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Teresa. Such great insights into community engaged design processes. Thank you for pointing out that we don't get that training in school. How do you ensure that the community members who participate in the process represent the larger community? And how do you address histories of disenfranchisement by designers, planners, and the ensuing potential associated distrust from community members?
You know, and this is where partnering with existing community leadership, trusted community leadership and organizations is important. You never need to build a social infrastructure from scratch. Leadership exists in every single community. It's about you doing the work to find out, you know, where is that network, and is there space for you? You know, are you welcomed? And I think this is really important about the history of trust and harm that a lot of formal institutions had. And so from my personal experience, you know, I was a part of a really large multi-million-dollar organization that some community members, you know, will call poverty pimps. Like, you get millions of dollars and it trickles down, right? And so I actually went through probably over a year of just outreach, of attending meetings and being like, hi, I'm Teresa. Yes, I work for, you know, this organization, but this is the work that we're trying to build. These are the resources that I'm trying to leverage, actually redistribute. But I also came from a place of, again, like personal alignment. I was like, I'm not doing this work because I'm trying to, you know, get the organization to more visibility or sort of, you know, put another project on their website. It's, you know, I've also experienced X, Y, and Z. I realized that by not creating, you know, a community vision, that the harm is going to perpetuate. And ultimately came down to my own personal relationships that I built with community leaders, and sort of the trust that it took, and the time that it took to build that. So I would say no when you're walking into an existing environment and who you are also representing, like say you work for the city or again, an organization that has, but then also it's important to be like, you know what, this is not right. No matter how good how much love I have to share, actually my presence is only going to cause more harm. And so like this project is not going to get off the ground. And that's a really important thing. Like you can't force safety. And that is something that I just, you feel it. You can't force feelings.
This next question in some ways is connected to the previous one. And someone says this participatory collective design process seems not only ethically superior to the traditional process, but truer to the spirit of flexible, iterative design. Yet, as you pointed out, the skills necessary to engage in it are not typically part of formal education. How do you think that could be changed from both a practical and ethical perspective? I guess it's in some ways, how do you, build capacity for us as designers? I mean, we all have feelings. We're going to hopefully have a sense of empathy in our work, but are there particular toolkits or, how do we formally change that?
I mean, I think it needs to be experienced. And so for me, it was going to community meetings. It was, there's a Chinatown campaign about evictions, like show up as a citizen, right? And then come early and set up chairs and watch how community agreements are spoken. How is language translation being performed? But I also want to then now speak to sort of like the educators and the faculty in the room. It's how is pedagogy becoming more participatory? Like, are there spaces to facilitate seminars or studio so that, you're actually organizing your peers? Because you don't want your first time leading a community meeting to actually be in a community meeting with, people who are charged and filled with trauma and rage and, trying to actually, looking for a place to vent. And so I'm just wondering, we have so much more awareness. How do we reconstruct our classroom to begin mirroring the community environments that we want to be working in?
Yeah, someone else posted in the chat that it's kind of picking up on what you were just saying, that opportunities for community growth can come from work and engagement within student organizations where those groups engage with community projects both inside the school and outside. There are many soft skills to be learned through this process. I love how you described, where did you put this? That community engagement was like a giant open mic. I love that. That's a kind of just a visual or kind of embodied way of talking about it. Let's see, another question people have, how do you think the lack of affordable housing plays into homelessness in the US? Do you think tackling affordable housing impacts homelessness, or are these separate issues that require separate solutions? P.S. Happy birthday to your little one.
Thank you all. I appreciate so much love. I'm like, these are big questions, and it takes many forms, right? We need to reform housing policy to have more resources to get more affordable rentals on the market. But we also need to reimagine ownership of land as a fundamental concept that is completely exploitative and continues, the practice of colonization, right? This is where the imagination piece is so important. Like when I see things like community land trusts, that's reconceptualizing what land ownership looks like is important. This is systems change. And, I'm going to sort of throw back to the group and be like, well, what is then the role of the designer? Because for me, I'll be honest, I've never been very even good at just aesthetic design and how do the way things look. I was more interested in like, we fundamentally can synthesize and put disparate pieces together into a beautiful masterpiece. And so it's like, how can we begin redesigning some of these systems, and some of it needs to just be burned to the ground.
I have a question, Teresa. Thank you so much for sharing and your story too, and your journey, and just being so open and honest. It's really inspiring to see how you've woven all this in. One thing I wanted to ask you is I really appreciated your community agreements, and I had put in the text. I noticed that one of the agreements is not to do screen captures without asking. And so I wanted to ask, we do have a new space and race kind of forum where we're discussing, design education and practice and what it might look like. And I just wondered if you might consider, you don't have to answer now, you can follow up with Jennifer, who's coordinated, if you might share that, because it was really a beautiful list. And I'm just thinking, even when I'm starting a new studio next week, I think that might be our first exercise, what our agreements do. And I really get the safe space thing and how we really need to redesign how we're educating and how we are practicing. So that was a question. You don't have to answer right now, and just thank you so much. Just really, really appreciate you being here.
Pleasure. And the co-creation of these agreements becomes really important. And so, I also want to say that was specific to Design Futures. And so it was also about, the screen capture piece was also about sort of protecting some of the intellectual property of the people who were giving workshops, as to honor the effort. And we don't want people to like take it and post on social media when it actually is sort of like a in the moment experience. And so for me, I also want to say, like, agreements always change. It depends on who's in the room, and also like how I'm feeling. For me, it's an articulation of so many things. It's like anti-racist justice work, it's practices of mindfulness, it's also sort of like I don't know, just love, right? And how do we center that? And I think for me, what I've started to do is, I started within the beginning, I was like, I'm just going to talk about my personal life, because like I'm so exhausted hiding or piecing it out. And I think again, Jennifer, I appreciate it. It's like a way of, I guess, modeling it, but I'm also like, oh, this is just who I am. And if it freaks you out that I got emotional or if I cried, I'm like, then, that's okay. Like, ask yourself why you feel uncomfortable. But I appreciate the fact that I felt safe enough actually through a screen and connected to you all to be able to do that. So I appreciate it. I always tell people, if we have cried together, we are in community together. So we are in community together.
I think it's just showing the power of being vulnerable, and that is also part of forging connection with people and being in community with people, is that you are willing to share of yourself. So we so appreciate your words and I don't know, just the way you're demonstrating that for us today. So I think it's really fantastic. There are more comments in here, but I am mindful of the time and the fact that that studio starts in 5 minutes. But I know that folks were definitely impacted by your talk, just by seeing the things that they're posting here. One says, vulnerability this semester has been rare. Thank you so much for bringing this into our community. So with that, thank you so much, Teresa. And I guess I will follow up with you by email, but this was really fantastic. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.